My name is Caitlin Padavano, and I am the Director of Education and Outreach for University Equity and Inclusion, and I'm just so excited to welcome everyone to our event today. So we're going to start with just a couple community agreements that will carry us through this day. They will be echoed in Kazu's keynote, in our story circles, in the afternoons. We want to create for the EAD space a low shame but high responsibility environment. So we want to hold each other accountable today with kindness. We hope that you attend with an open and self-reflective mind. We ask everyone to speak from I statements, so speaking from our own experiences. We're going to be sharing our experiences in the story circles. We can only speak from our own truths, and we want to honor the truths of others as well. We want to offer dignity in words and actions, especially when we disagree. We're going to be talking about creating safe spaces so we can have productive conflict and disagreement. But even when we do so, we want to honor the humanity and dignity of those around us. And then my favorite one, turn to wonder. So we're going to be talking about some complicated topics today. I invite folks, if something feels uncomfortable, if you're not sure where something is coming from, get curious. Instead of judging yourself, which we tend to do, or others, turn to wonder. I wonder what this teaches me about myself. What are story circles? Story circles are a way to gather people to share and witness each other's stories. Why do we use them? They're a highly flexible tool that invite us to be in closer connection with one another. One of our goals within our Rutgers Diversity Goal is to build community across difference, which in these divided times is even more difficult than ever. So story circles are a way to help us find commonalities in our lived experience, celebrate differences in our experiences, and work together towards inclusion. And then again, this is going to be rolled out as a university-wide initiative in the fall, so please stay tuned for more, and please come join us for our story circles this afternoon. So thank you so much again for being here. This is our 4th annual Education as Disruption event. And this intensive was developed with the recognition that education is not just a tool for knowledge, it has the power to heal, disrupt, and transform. In fact, education is so powerful that there are those who want to destroy it and divide us. In times of such deep division, there is power in gathering together to learn, grow, and most importantly, to listen to each other's stories. This morning, our keynote speaker, anti-violence activist, and author of Fierce Vulnerability, Kazu Haga, will dare us to challenge the binary stories we tell ourselves and one another, and to embrace vulnerability as a source of strength. In the afternoon, our Bridging the Gap Fellows will lead us in community story circles of transformative practice from the civil rights movement that help build relationships across difference. For 3 months, our Bridging the Gap Fellows have been working through Interfaith America's Skills for Bridging the Gap curriculum, building skills and knowledge to better engage across deep divides. Now the fellows are ready to bring their expertise to the Rutgers community. April 9th is also a significant day for Rutgers as we honor the first ever Paul Robeson Day, recently designated by the New Jersey State Senate. In divided times, it's essential that we look to those who have come before us for guidance. Paul Robeson used his platform to fiercely challenge injustice and, perhaps more importantly, champion the inherent humanity, dignity, and worth of all people. May we remember him as we gather today to use education as a tool for disruption and honor each other's stories as a bold act of resistance against a divided world. Thank you.
My name is Joan Collier. I am Assistant Vice President for Learning and Engagement in the Office of University Equity and Inclusion, and I get the pleasure to introduce our keynote for the morning, Kazu Haga. And so, yes. And so if y'all don't know, he's been with us on multiple occasions. So Kazu joined us last January of 2024 to talk about what does community mean in the midst of polarization. How do we work through that? So then in the fall, we brought him back to campus for the inaugural Affirming Humanity's Tensions lecture that we had. And there he talked about maintaining resilience or building resilience And we thought about the framework of Pauli Murray, who talked about drawing a larger circle when your brothers seek to exclude you, right? So if someone goes to exclude you, you go, nope, not. I'm gonna draw a bigger circle and include them too. And we were like, we're really challenged by this. But that's what we do. And so when we got to the EAD and thought about what does it mean to affirm humanity, we said, oh, there's a couple people we could invite. And so we are here today with Kazu, who has a new text out called Fierce Vulnerability. And that text speaks to where we are about how do we actually do the work in real time across real differences where there's still active harm happening. And we need to actually be able to see and connect and engage and build bridges when it requires us to be not overexposed, but very clear. Kazu is a Kingian practitioner. I would call him scholar, and someone who continues to offer loving corrections and guidance on how we actually do the work beyond the theoretical. It is very easy to say build a bridge. It is very different to do the work of building it. So I'm going to turn it over to Kazu so he can get us in order. Kazu Haga.
Yeah, it's been a while. I'm really, really honored to be here again. A lot has changed since the last time I was here, different campus, but let's see. I think I was here last October. Since then, I became a U.S. citizen, which, you know, some mixed feelings about in this time, but we had an election, we had an inauguration, and, you know, I've been thinking a lot about just the constant attacks against DEI. And I was recently watching an interview with Pete Buttigieg, who was talking about how, well, you know, if we're going to talk about DEI, let's think about what the opposite of DEI is. The opposite of DEI is uniformity, inequity, and exclusion. And who would argue that our country could benefit from more uniformity, more inequity, and more exclusion? Right? So that really speaks to the importance of the work of DEI, the work of the university, Rutgers University Equity and Inclusion. So I'm really, really honored to be here again. Really grateful to Joan and Stephanie and everyone else who's really doing the grind day to day to continue to make a world where more and more of us can belong. I'm also excited to be talking about this idea of education as disruption, because like folks were saying before, real education in a world where so much uniformity, inequity, and exclusion is being normalized is disruptive, right? It is highly disruptive. The work of education, we think of education as, oh, sitting quietly in a classroom, just receiving information. But real education in a world where so much division is normalized is very disruptive. And I want to talk about this idea of disruption. This is a photo of a woman named Autherine Lucy, who was very disruptive in her age, in her era. She was the first black student ever to go to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, right after Brown versus the Board of Education. And you can imagine, right after Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, what the environment of that campus must have been like the first moment she stepped foot. These are some of the images of what happened on campus. A riot broke out. The KKK came and burnt a cross in the middle of campus. A mob threw stones at her and threw stones at the window of the university president's home. A group surrounded the car she was traveling in and climbed up on top, started jumping up and down. All this violence happened, right? What do you imagine the school did to respond to all of this violence on campus? Right? Like, they couldn't expel her anymore because she was black, right? But they actually expelled her and said, all of this violence is happening because you're here, right? Like, you are the reason why all of these riots are happening. So in order for us to protect our school, in order for us to protect the safety of our students, you need to leave. So they expelled her. Next day, she wasn't on campus anymore, so the riots had stopped. And the local newspaper ran this headline that said, "Things are quiet in Tuscaloosa today. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama." Like, there is peace. Dr. King gave one of my all-time favorite sermons in response to this incident The sermon is called When Peace Becomes Obnoxious. And in that sermon, he talked about this idea of negative peace. Negative peace is a term that was initially coined by a peace educator named Johan Goltang, who started the field of peace and conflict studies in higher education. And in this sermon, When Peace Becomes Obnoxious, Dr. King said that what happened on the university campus wasn't a real peace, right? He said it was a negative peace, which is the absence of tension that comes at the expense of justice. He said that this is the type of peace that stinks in the nostrils of the Almighty God, and that it is a type of peace that all people of goodwill should be fighting against, right? We think of peace as quiet and calm, right? Like as long as everything is quiet, as long as things are calm, then it's peaceful. But I oftentimes argue that the moment after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, I bet you things got really quiet. And that is not a way to go about creating peace, right? If someone is screaming in my face, that's not peaceful. But if I punch them in the face and knock them unconscious, well, things are quiet now, so that I just create peace. It is a negative peace that comes at the expense of justice by sweeping issues under the rug. As crazy as those ideas are, right, that I can create peace by punching someone unconscious and making sure that they can't scream at me anymore, because of our society's gross misunderstandings of the idea of peace, this is how we oftentimes try to go about creating peace. Right, the war on terror. If we just kill all the terrorists, then we can have peace at home. Mass incarceration. If we just lock up all the criminals, then we can have peace in our communities. The militarization of the police. If all the Black Lives Matter protesters would just shut up, then things would be quieter in our neighborhood. We would have peace. And Dr. King and all the civil rights workers back in those days were constantly accused of creating tension, creating conflict. And Dr. King used to say, yeah, well, if black people accepted second-class citizenship, it would be quieter in your neighborhoods because we wouldn't be out here protesting, but that is not a real peace, right? And this kind of peace that exists very commonly in spaces of higher education and professional environments and many of our homes and families and a lot of faith communities. I was at a conference years ago and someone called it the tyranny of civility, right? Like we're taught to be civil, we're taught to be polite, and oftentimes bringing up issues of injustice, issues of power dynamics, of inequality is uncomfortable. So it makes it feel like the person that's bringing up the issue is creating tension, but all they're doing is bringing the unseen tension to the table so we can actually talk about it, right? I was born in Japan, and I come from a Japanese household. Japan is a country that loves negative peace, right? Like, it's what my family dinners oftentimes look like. If you joined us for dinner, you would think that we're a peaceful family. If you went to Japan for 2 weeks, you'd think it's a peaceful country, right? Very few homicides, one of the highest suicide rates in the entire world, very high rates of domestic violence, alcoholism. Like just beneath the surface, there's a ton of violence because culturally, we don't know how to have difficult conversations around trauma and around shame and around violence and around conflict and inequality. Right? It's really uncomfortable to talk about those issues, so we like to suppress it and pretend that it's not there. So from the outside looking in, it looks like we're a peaceful nation. It looks like we have a peaceful family, but we have so much trauma that me and my family have experienced from early childhood that we're just beginning to learn to talk about so that we can heal those wounds. And it's really uncomfortable. So if this is negative peace, then positive peace is loud and messy, right? We think peace building is a nice, neat, calm process. It is not. It is loud and messy. When I first started having conversation with my family about our early childhood traumas, it was really messy. But that's what's required to create healing. If you go into the hospital for an operation, like operating rooms are not clean places. They're messy processes because that is what's required for healing. It includes a journey to build justice for all people and builds towards beloved community by dealing with the root causes. This is not a peaceful image. Many of you know the only time that I know of that fire hoses were used in the civil rights movement was in Birmingham, Alabama, and it was against children, high school and middle school students who had the courage when all the adults were locked up and none of the other adults had the courage to continue to stand up. It was children who said, I'll go out there and I'll demand justice for our people. This is not a peaceful image, but in some ways, this image is closer to peace than this image of this awkward family who doesn't have the courage or the skills to talk about difficult issues. At least these kids had the courage to bring issues that needed to be discussed to the surface. Water protectors who are disrupting the construction of oil pipelines that would go through indigenous communities, low-income communities. The purpose of nonviolent direct action is to disturb business as usual, right? The umbrella movement in Hong Kong that fought for democracy. And also, we have to remember that Dr. Martin Luther King, who, our country loves to parade around every January as a symbol for this country's supposed morals, we have to remember that he was really unpopular when he was actually alive, particularly among white communities. He was highly unpopular because he was demanding that this country have conversations that a lot of people were not ready to have. Dr. King was arrested 29 times throughout his life, and half of those times, he was charged by the United States government for disturbing the peace, right? Like one of the greatest peacemakers our country has ever known was charged criminally by the United States government for disturbing the peace. And we have to remember that when we use nonviolence to bring difficult issues to the table, whether it's in our homes, in our families, in our college campuses, in the world outside, when we use nonviolence to force issues to the table that the broader community is not ready to have, we're not disturbing peace, we're disturbing complacency, right? We're disturbing the normalization of violence. And if we're not looking at it carefully, it might look like we're creating tension, we're creating conflict. But that's not, we're just bringing the conflict to the surface and disturbing the normalization of that happens. One of my favorite pieces of writing comes from a feminist activist from the 1970s named Barbara Demings, who wrote this thing called The Two Hands of Nonviolence. And she said that with one hand, we say to one who is angry or to an oppressor or to an unjust system, stop what you are doing. I refuse to honor the role you are playing. I refuse to obey you. I refuse to cooperate with your demands. I refuse to build the walls and the bombs. I refuse to pay for the guns. With this hand, I will even interfere with the wrong you are doing. I want to disrupt the easy pattern of your life. Right? That is disruption. And it is an important part of nonviolence, the work of nonviolence. But at the same time, she also wrote, but then the advocate of nonviolence raises the other hand. It is raised outstretched, maybe with love and sympathy, maybe not, but always outstretched. With this hand we say, I won't let go of you or cast you out of the human race. I have faith that you can make a better choice than you are making now, and I'll be here when you are ready. Like it or not, we are part of one another. And I find that to be one of the most concise and beautiful descriptions of nonviolence. That we have the power to say no, to disrupt injustice, to disrupt violence, but also the commitment to continue to say yes, that we belong to one another, that I know that you can do better. And so that is the challenge that's ahead of us, right? How do we disrupt injustice while remaining open? Because education at the end of the day is not about shutting down minds, but it's about opening up minds. So how do we open up minds in a way that creates connection while being able to challenge some of the harmful narratives and the cultural norms that are being spread out in the world today? I think I mentioned this last time I was here, we live in incredibly chaotic times, right? And when times are really uncertain, people crave the stability of a black and white world. There's something about the black, white, us-them narrative that calms our nervous system. It's very simple to understand. And that simplicity grounds us in this really uncertain time there is something that we crave about the simplicity of the us versus them worldview, even if that is something that is ultimately harming us. Like, this is a psychological thing. But I'm wondering if in these uncertain times, we need something to ground us, if the idea of beloved community can instead become our new grounding. If we can believe that, if I can believe that I belong, that there's nothing outside of my belonging to the rest of existence, then maybe I can be grounded enough to open up curiosity for someone else's story, right? So can I believe in my own belonging enough that I can let go of the us versus them worldview, the black-white binary, and ground in my own sense of belonging and my relationship with beloved community, that I can open up that space for other people and maybe not feel a need to threaten someone else's belonging because I'm so certain in my own sense of belonging. I'm sure many folks have heard statements like this, right? Like, yes, I want to build bridges, except with that person or those people. And I'm human too. I believe this all the time. I get to this place all the time, and it is a constant struggle, right? Because when we are in states of panic, the part of our brain that is capable of curiosity is shut down. I think I mentioned this last time too. This is like a physiological, neurobiological thing that happens, right? When we are in moments of panic, when our emotions are dysregulated, the part of our brain that is responsible for empathy, taking in new perspectives, integrating different opinions, is not accessible to us, right? So it's really difficult in these escalated times to say, yes, I want to build bridges even with those people. Before we are able to build that bridge, we have to have a solid foundation on our side of the bridge, of the cliff, right? Like, we need to be willing to be the bridge builders. And so I want to offer a few tools that might help us ground in our own sense of belonging so that we can have curiosity about someone else's life story. This is an old teaching that I first learned from Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was the co-author of the King in Nonviolence curriculum, was also the national coordinator of the original Poor People's Campaign, one of the lead organizers of the Civil Rights Movement. And he taught me this really beautiful model. And he told me that as human beings, we all have the capacity for aggression and for anger, right? That's a natural, righteous human response to witnessing injustice. And in society, we have this tendency to take all of our aggression out on individual people. And at the same time, as human beings, we all also have the capacity for conciliation. Conciliation, I heard a definition once, that conciliation is the capacity to make one comfortable with something. So reconciliation is the capacity to make two people comfortable with each other again, right? So conciliation could be also be understood as compassion, understanding. We have this tendency to take our capacity for conciliatory attitudes and channel it towards broad conditions. And what that looks like is, you take an issue like youth violence, right? We get angry at young people, say, young people, you're lazy, you're ignorant, what's wrong with you? Get a job, we're gonna lock you up and throw away the key if you engage in acts of violence. But then we take the broad conditions surrounding youth violence, and we have this tendency to be like, oh, I feel so bad for young people who come up in broken homes. I feel so bad for young people who grow up in poverty and don't go to schools with resources. I feel so bad for all the people locked up in prisons. And that kind of compassion towards broad condition changes nothing, right? It actually maintains the status quo. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King is when he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." When we take our aggression out on people, that is us practicing power in the absence of love. It gets expressed as blind rage, which just burns down everything in its path. And at the same time, when we practice compassion, conciliation towards broad conditions, it gets expressed as charity. It is love without power. It might make me feel better about the fact that those people are suffering because at least I'm giving some empathy, but it does nothing to challenge the conditions that cause that suffering in the first place. In nonviolence, our goal is to channel all of our righteous indignation towards the broad conditions that created injustice, and at the same time, somehow cultivate love in our heart, what Dr. King called agape love, towards the broad conditions, or towards all of the people that are caught up in those conditions. And it is this X that marks our target in nonviolence, right? We believe that if we can channel aggression towards broad conditions and conciliatory attitudes towards all the people that are caught up in those conditions, then maybe transformative change can happen. Dr. King talked about this idea of righteous indignation. Right? There's oftentimes this misnomer in nonviolence that nonviolence is about teaching people not to be angry. And that actually in some ways creates a sense of negative peace by repressing people's righteous responses to witnessing injustice. Right? Dr. King, I always say, was one of the most pissed off people in the country. He was angry about racism. He was angry about poverty and injustice. And it's important that we not think, oh, we're trying to practice nonviolence, so we need to be calm and take deep breaths and not be angry. What we need to do is honor our anger, but just remove the hatred that oftentimes arises at the same time as our anger. Right? So oftentimes anger and hatred comes up in our bodies, emerges at the same time, and that is the piece of it that is unhealthy. Someone once taught me that hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Right? Like, the person that you're hating on is probably having a wonderful day, not even thinking about you, right? And meanwhile, you can't do anything productive in life. And so the teachings of nonviolence does not say that anger is wrong, but it is the kind of the seed of hatred that oftentimes arises with the anger. We need to find out how to divorce the hatred from the anger and release and integrate the hatred and still be able to channel anger in the right direction. And also love. Dr. King talked about how in the Greek language, there's 5 different words for love. Whereas in Japanese, like the word for love, ai, only refers to romantic love. Like there's no other way to say that you love something in Japanese outside of a romantic context. And even that you almost never say, right? But in the English language, I love my partner as I love my child. I also love a good cheesesteak. I love the Boston Celtics. They're very different kinds of love, but because we only have this one word, a lot of different emotions get conflated. But in the Greek language, there's at least 5 different words for love, right? There's eros, which in the kind of modern society has come to be known as like erotic love, romantic love, but historically it was this like lust and love for life. There's philia. The city of Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. It's that brotherly, sisterly love that you develop for your close friends, family. And there's agape, which is unconditional, universal love for all people, not because of some shared values that you have or experiences that you've had together, but because they exist, because you acknowledge their sanctity and dignity just for existing. I talked about this last time as well. The importance of curiosity and how curiosity gets shut down when we are in states of panic. But I've really come to believe that curiosity is one of the most powerful tools that we can have to build bridges with the other side, with people who we perceive to be on the other side. But when we get angry, like it's important to have curiosity about the other side, but we, as I said, like it's that curiosity isn't accessible to us, right? One place where you could start is when we get angry to become curious actually about yourself first, right? Like what is coming up from me in that anger? And can I attune to what is coming up from me? I just came out of this week-long experience called the Asian Diaspora Jam. I think I talked about jams last time too. Jams are these like week-long, really powerful retreats for social change makers and one of the most healing spaces of belonging I've ever been to. And every year we do this thing called the Asian Diaspora Jam, which is a space for folks from the Asian diaspora. So we just spent a week up in the mountains in Santa Cruz. And jams are a place where a lot of vulnerability is shared. It's a space where we just strip away all of the masks and the layers, and we just get to be deeply, deeply human with each other. And we slow down enough to create space for whatever is present for each person to really be held and witnessed. And so, during our check-ins and things like that, there's a lot of vulnerable stories that are shared. And at one point during the gathering, some of the participants, you could tell, started getting uneasy. And one participant shared a really vulnerable story about what they were going through. And we went down the line, and we were, 2-3 people later in the check-in. And someone else in the circle raised their hand and said, I have a question. I need to slow us down. I'm really worried about this person that shared this vulnerable story, and I really feel like we need to continue to check in with them, and I can't move on. And then a couple other hands went up. It was like, oh, I feel the same. We need to slow this process down. Are we holding space for everyone in a skillful way? And I realized at the time that I'm sure that these people did have genuine concern for this original person that shared their vulnerability, right? But I was also looking at that person, and they actually looked like they were grounded. They actually looked like they were okay. And I realized that what was coming up for all these people who were raising their hands was like something was coming up for them, right? They were beginning to feel perhaps a little bit uncomfortable with the vulnerability that was being shared in the room. And because their vulnerability felt so uncomfortable, it was perhaps easier for them to externalize it as concern for that person. And I realized that I oftentimes do this in my relationship with my partner too, right? Like when they express vulnerability, like I'm a fixer. So my habit is to try to fix what's bothering them. And so immediately I go to strategies of, well, what if you do this? And maybe if you say this, you'll feel better. And at some point I realized that a lot of my fixing wasn't even about concern for them. It was because I was feeling so uncomfortable with them being vulnerable that it was like I was trying to do whatever I needed to do to shut down their vulnerability so I would feel more comfortable. But it was about me, and it was not about them. And I feel like a very similar dynamic happens when we become angry. When we become angry, it's oftentimes that something is coming up from me that is really uncomfortable to feel. And because anger is, whatever that is beneath the anger is uncomfortable to feel, we externalize that feeling as anger towards that person. Like me feeling angry about them is much easier to feel than acknowledging that, oh, I'm actually afraid that I might lose my job with all of these cuts, right? And that is a real thing. There's plenty of space for me to still have that no hand and to hold people accountable for things that are doing that I think is going to cause legitimate, real harm to a lot of communities that I care about. But if I can be attuned to what is beneath my anger, then maybe it becomes a little bit easier for me to remove that seed of hatred so that I can channel my anger in the right direction. I have a lot of fear right now. And if I don't create space in my life to actually live into that fear and to acknowledge it and to honor it, it's very easy that when anger arises that I'm not aware of the hatred that is arising with it. They say anger is a secondary reaction that your body has to hide something even deeper. And so can we be in touch? Can we be curious about what is underneath our own anger as a way to begin to have a healthier relationship with our anger so that we can channel it in the right directions? Rage, I mentioned, is like a burning wildfire, right? It's uncontrollable. There's nothing you can do to control its path. It just burns down everything in its path. But righteous indignation is like a charcoal. It's channeled. You can hold it. You can use it to warm up food. You can use it to heat your house, right? You can play with it very skillfully. I want to share a story that I shared in my in the book that just came out. In 1945, on August 6th, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, right? The atomic bomb. And there was a guy who was, at the time, in the Japanese military, and he had an uncle that lived in Hiroshima. And so the morning after the bomb was dropped, he went to his uncle owned the bookstore. So he went into town to the bookstore to look for his uncle. And of course, the entire bookstore was just gone. His uncle was nowhere to be seen. and there was a fire still burning where the bookstore once stood. And so at the time, this guy in Japan, people used to carry little like charcoal warmers. They would put charcoal in this little metal box, and they would wrap that metal box in a piece of cloth, and they would use it as like the kind of like hand warmers that we use today, that you shake up and it becomes warm. You can put it in your jacket. And so he used the fire that was burning where the bookstore once stood to light his charcoal to keep himself warm, and he eventually went home. And then when he got home, he used that charcoal to light the fire in his home to keep his house warm. And he kept feeding that fire. He kept feeding that fire over and over. He actually never let that fire die out. And he said that for years, that fire represented the anger that he had in his heart about what happened with the bomb. And eventually, the people in his village found out about this fire, and they moved that fire to a monastery where they lit an eternal flame that still burns to this day. And over years and years of fueling this fire, the man who originally started the fire said that eventually his feelings transformed because he had this like physical manifestation of fire that could like hold all of his anger. And ultimately, this fire became to symbolize his desire for world peace. And so now that flame still burns in this monastery outside of Hiroshima as an eternal flame for peace. And about 20 years ago now, one of the nuns that took me under her wing years ago, Jun-san, led a peace march across the country. And in this peace march, they actually used the eternal flame outside of Hiroshima to light a similar charcoal holder that this guy used to carry. And they carried that charcoal across the ocean, initially to Mexico, and then back across the border of the United States. And they carried this charcoal holder with them on the entire walk. And I remember taking part in that walk for a few days, and at one point, one of the leaders of the walk said, "Hey, do you want to carry this charcoal holder?" And I remember vividly the moment that he placed this charcoal warmer in my hand. I was like, this charcoal warmer holds a piece of charcoal that was lit by the flames that was created by the atom bomb. Like, it's the same flame. And over decades and decades and decades, it had become this prayer, this symbol for world peace. Because after years and years of praying on it, the original person that started the fire was able to remove the seed of hatred from his anger. Right? It was still this powerful symbol, but it became a symbol for peace. And so if we can have a healthy relationship, a skillful relationship with our anger, it can become this powerful motivator for bridge building. So much of this work that we do in nonviolence and diversity, equity, and inclusion is about speaking our truth, right? The truth about what is beneath our anger, the truth about what we want to see in the world. And sometimes I am scared is one of the most vulnerable and deepest truths that we can share. And because it is so vulnerable, it has the possibility to create deep connections. A lot of what this idea of fierce vulnerability is about. If we can model vulnerability, then it has the possibility to create deep, deep connection. Last time I was here, I was sharing these questions that I learned from this organization, Braver Angels, that they say that when you get into a political disagreement, they advise or propose 2 questions to ask. One is, how did you get to the place in your life where you have the beliefs that you have? What is the story of your life? And also, why does this statement make you feel safe and make me feel unsafe? Right? So can I understand my own truth enough that I can extend that bridge of curiosity? Like, can I be grounded in my own truth enough to open up curiosity? So I actually want to invite us into a practice. In a second, I'm going to give you the instructions. I'm going to ask you to get into pairs or small groups of 3, and I believe that this is going to be possible on Zoom as well for those of us that are, or for those of you that are joining online. And perhaps if you're watching the video later, you can pause the video after I give the instructions and go try it with a friend. There's a tool that I love called appreciative inquiry, which is a tool that I first learned at a jam. And appreciative inquiry is a practice. Curiosity is a practice. Because I feel like in a lot of our educational settings, we're not taught to be curious anymore. We're taught to like believe the things that we're supposed to believe and stop asking questions, right? So in a world where that is the norm, curiosity is something that we have to practice to build a muscle for. So appreciative inquiry is a practice that helps us come up with questions that actually create connection. If I ask someone, hey, how are you doing? That's actually not a real question. Like, when was the last time you asked someone how you're doing and actually meant it? Or the last time someone asked you how you're doing and you felt like they actually meant it? How are you is no longer an actual question, right? It's a formality. If I ask you how you're doing, I'm expecting you to say, oh, I'm doing fine, how are you, right? Fine tells me nothing about how you're actually doing. It tells me nothing about who you are. It gives me no information about what's going on in the inner landscape of your life. Even as the person asking the question, I'm kind of tuned out because I'm not expecting a thoughtful response. That's one of the things I love about jams is we actually slow down enough to actually ask people, how are you actually doing in this moment? Take all the time you want, you know? If I ask, instead of how are you doing, if I ask someone, what's one wonderful thing that happened to you today? Then I'm asking a question that invokes a story, right? Like, it can't be answered in a 1 or 2 word response. It requires that person to share something about themselves, and it gives me an opportunity to learn something deeper about them that I might not have known. We get a window into who this person is as a human being, right? So there's 4 elements of appreciative inquiry that I want to offer right now. One is substance, right? An appreciative inquiry question is a question that elicits like a chunky response. It's a question that cannot be answered in 1 or 2 words, right? Like, what's one thing wonderful that happened to you today can't be answered in 1 or 2 words. Second aspect of appreciative inquiry is it has to come from a place of genuine curiosity. Like, you can't know the answer to this question, and you have to genuinely want to know the answer to this question, right? So asking yourself, do I actually want to listen? Because if you ask a question that you're not actually curious about, once they start responding, you might tune out, right? Integrity. This is a question that you have to be willing to answer yourself. You have to be willing to share the response to that question to the person that you're asking to as well. And finally, one element of appreciative inquiry is that it has to be something that evokes a positive feeling, right? There's a difference between asking a person, hey, what's one problem that you are dealing with in your life today? Versus, what is one strength that you can draw on to face one of the challenges that you are going through in your life today? Does that make sense? So what we want to do is ideally to pair up with someone sitting next to you, someone sitting close to you. Because of the numbers, there may be 1 or 2 groups of 3, that's fine, but try to find yourself in a group of 2. For those of you on Zoom, hopefully you'll end up in a room of 2, you might end up in a room of 3. And I'm gonna give you 3 minutes to come up with 3 appreciative inquiry questions. Write them down on your phone, on a piece of paper. Just think of 3 questions that you want to ask your partner or the other members of your group. And then you will have 1 minute to share your 3 questions with your partner or the members of your group. And then each person will have about 4 minutes to respond to one of the 3 questions that your partner asked you. So take in the 3 questions that your partner is asking you, choose the one that you want to respond to, and you have about 4 minutes to respond. If you are in a group of 3, you'll just have to manage your time and cut the time a little bit short. I'll give you all warnings after the 3 minutes that you have to write your questions, the 1 minute that you have to share your questions, the 4 minutes per person that you have to share your questions. And then after that, you'll have about 4 minutes just to debrief with your partner about what that experience was like. So if you're in a group of 3, you might not have as much time to debrief in the group, but you'll have a little bit more time for the third person to share. And then we'll come back as a large group and then debrief in a large group about what that practice was like. So again, here's the 4 elements of appreciative inquiry. A question that has substance, a question that you are genuinely curious about, a question that you are willing to answer yourself, and a question that evokes something positive. Write 3 questions that you might want to ask somebody run through this list, make sure your questions have elements of all 4 of those, and then you'll find yourself in a pair. And so I'll give you 3 minutes right now, and I'll tell you when that 3 minutes is up. All right, sounds good. So again, you'll have about a minute to introduce yourselves, and then to share the 3 questions that you both came up with. And then I'll tell you when you can start. And you can start your conversation whenever, but I'll tell you when the first 4 minutes starts, and one person will have 4 minutes to respond to one of the 3 questions that your partner asked you. Okay. So about a minute to introduce yourself and share your questions. All right, so starting to transition to the first person responding to one of the questions. You have about 4 minutes. About 1 minute left for the first person to share. All right, so the first person starting to wrap up your story and transitioning to the second person whenever you're ready. All right, so beginning to wrap up your conversations, thanking your partner, and then let's come back to the center of the room. So we'll do more of an official Q&A conversation a little bit later, but for a little bit, I just want to just get some thoughts on how this activity was. I know that for me, it's actually difficult to come up with these appreciative inquiry questions because I'm not used to really being that curious and inquisitive about someone's story, and that's just with the people in my life. Never mind a stranger that might have very different political beliefs than I do. Right? So I have to really challenge myself to come up with questions that invites their story, that I'm curious enough that I'm actually interested in who they are as a person, not just the surface level political beliefs that they might hold. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear a little bit about what that experience was like, some of the questions that you all came up with, some of the stories that you might have shared. Yeah, any thoughts you have? Yeah, I'm just going to repeat some of what you shared just for the recording and all that. I heard that there's different levels of curiosity depending on how much you're willing to hear. There's the superficial, almost what's the data, the information, and then there's another level of curiosity about am I ready to hear something that might be difficult for me to hear, something that I might disagree with. So depending on kind of your level of curiosity, the depth of your inquiry might shift. Yeah. I talked about this before too, right? The power of a story. That I really have this theory that when you understand someone's story, everything they do, everything they say, everything they believe begins to make sense. It doesn't condone what they do, it doesn't condone what they believe, but it begins to be a lot easier to have compassion and to make a connection and to invite curiosity. And this is coming from, I've had the privilege to work with hundreds and hundreds of incarcerated people who have done some serious, serious harm. And every single time I've had the patience to really listen to that person's story, it's almost oh, I get why you did what you did. And it's I understand why you would have the belief systems that you did. I don't condone those belief systems. I don't condone what you did, but it begins to be easier, right? There's a teaching in nonviolence that says that everything that we do and we say as human beings are an attempt to meet universal needs. That as human beings, we all have universal needs that are all shared. Needs for physical safety, needs to be heard, needs for validation, needs for purpose. And sometimes we choose very poor strategies to try to get those needs met. So if I have a need to be heard that is not being met, I might try to scream at you. It might be not the most effective strategy to be heard. It's a poor strategy, an unskillful one, but it's still an attempt to try to meet a need. And if someone can understand that that's what I'm trying to do, maybe it's a little bit easier for them to have curiosity about why I might be screaming at them, right? One of my favorite definitions of violence that I've ever heard is the founder of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, says, violence is the tragic expression of unmet needs. Right? I love that. The tragic expression of unmet needs. I used to work with an incarcerated man who was serving a life sentence for a homicide he committed as a young man. And when he was sharing his story, he said that, I remember every time I pulled the trigger, it felt like I was throwing my anger out at my victim. And it was such a visceral image. It was so clear that this young man needed release, needed to be heard, needed to feel powerful, whatever need it was. It was something else other than him just being a hateful person wanting to kill somebody. right? So if we can understand that person's story, it begins to be so much easier to invite curiosity about that person's life. There's a difference between agreeing with someone and honoring their dignity enough to know that they have a story, right? And that you might actually be able to learn something from their story. Oftentimes we think that, well, if we invite curiosity, if we actually care about that person, if we agree with their story, then we have to agree with their beliefs, or we have to condone their actions. That is not true, right? Inviting curiosity is just about knowing that we are deeply interdependent as a species, and that my liberation is bound with their liberation, and it doesn't condone anything that they do, but it begins to be a lot easier to make connections. And again, none of this is to say that there isn't space for accountability, right? I shared a little bit about accountability last time I was here too, right? That accountability at its best is about healing. It is about offering space for someone to heal through their journey. Right? We conflate accountability and punishment, and we think accountability is a form of punishment that we shoved down someone's throat. I was watching a basketball game once years ago, and there's one of my favorite basketball announcers, Jeff Van Gundy, who's a coach now. He was just going off on one of the referees because he disagreed with the call that the referee had made. And it was going on and on and on about how referees are always demanding that the players need to be accountable, but referees need to be accountable when they make mistakes too. And in the middle of this like wild rant, he said this beautiful thing. He said, accountability isn't something you take, it's something you give. And I love that. Accountability isn't something that you can force down someone's throat or like pull it out of their throats, right? You can only create space for that person to go through their own journey of accountability. And that is not, like I oftentimes talk about when we think about the idea of holding someone accountable, that the key word shouldn't be accountable, the key word should be holding. Like, what does it mean to hold space for someone to go through their own journey of accountability so that they can understand their story enough to begin to feel a sense of remorse for the pain that they might have caused, right? That is not about going and pointing our fingers and saying you are wrong, but it's about saying what happened. Like, what happened in your life that led you to the moment that you made this choice to do what you did, right? It's about holding space for that person's story to emerge so that they can go through their own sense of remorse. And so, you know, before I open it up for discussions and questions, just one final invitation that even in the midst of conflict and even in the midst of harm and abuse and injustice, to stay connected enough to yourself, to be curious about yourself enough that you can ground yourself in your own truth so that you can open up the possibility of having curiosity about someone else. Because you might learn something from that person's story that helps you become whole. So thank you all so much for joining today, and we have a little bit of time. We have over a half hour actually, so love to open it up for, I think I shared one of the times I was here too. I was in a meditation retreat once and heard a Dharma talk from Reverend Angel Kilda Williams, who closed their session by saying, okay, so who's got some answers? So again, questions, reflections, answers, anything you might have, would just love to open it up for a discussion. So
I was in a protest space on Saturday, this past Saturday, and there were counter-protesters there. And I was there with my kids and found myself literally caught in the middle between counter-protesters and then protesters I was gathered with who were screaming at them and cursing at them. And I have a little bit of training on, how to de-escalate, but in that tension, I forgot it all, of course. Do you have any tips for actual protest or resistance spaces when this comes up, how to can't listen to their story necessarily, the counter-protesters, but how to kind of enact that in those spaces too?
I have a couple of thoughts, but I actually want to respond with the question, why not? I guess that would be one of my responses, right? So a couple of things. First, I really, really encourage people in communities, to the extent that you can do it, to prepare for these moments before you go to the protest. right? To like practice grounding yourself as a group, to practice mindful breathing exercises, to sing songs together, to share stories so that you're grounded in a small group before you go to the protest. Because once you're at a protest and you're already not grounded, and then there's counter protesters and there's police and there's yelling, it's very likely that you're going to get dysregulated. And by that point, it's almost too late because the part of your brain that is able to be curious is just gone. And so oftentimes before we go to protests, I remember years ago, my friend Oren, who is a meditation teacher, like led us in this beautiful, like the protest was happening a block away. We gathered with a group of 30 or 40 people a couple blocks away from the protest, and he led us in this beautiful like 10-minute meditation, and then we all went together so that we're showing up a little bit more grounded. So much of nonviolence is about how we prepare ourselves before the conflict erupts. And then, you know, once you're there, one of my favorite protests that I've ever been to was at a Black Lives Matter protest in Oakland years ago, where there was a group of activists who went right up to the line of riot police, and they weren't chanting, they weren't holding signs, they were actually holding mirrors, like reflecting back at the riot police. And it was almost this invitation to be like, do you see yourself? In this image, can you even see your own humanity? I don't know if I shared an image before of, I don't know if y'all remember the image of Aisha Evans. It was a young black single mother who was at a protest in Baton Rouge after the police murder of Alton Sterling. And there's this beautiful, I think the picture won a Pulitzer, this beautiful image of her just like standing there, like something like this with open arms, while these two riot police officers are like running towards her. And there's just something about that image that is so grounding, even though it was taken in this moment of high tension. And there's an interview that she gave later, because that image went viral, it became a really famous picture. And she said, the interviewer asked her, like, what was going on for you in this moment? And she said, in that moment, I was filled with curiosity. I was wondering what it must be like to be these police officers. Like, how can they sleep at night? Really actually curious about like what's going on. And that type of curiosity, I want to imagine, opens up something even in the riot police, just the way she was holding herself. And so whether it's riot police or counter protesters, I want to ask our communities to practice and prepare to respond to those moments in a way that might sow just a seed of curiosity in those people, right? Like, can we ask a question that seeds something in them that begins to move something inside of them, even if it's like hours after the protest, right? Like, instead of yelling back, instead of ignoring them, instead of denying that they're there, can we go and just ask some questions? And maybe they're not ready to respond in that moment, but can we seed some things that might break through the polarity and at some point down the road, maybe create some space for dialogue? So yeah, I always think about that, and you know, like when I used to go to nonviolence trainings back in the day, when I was, you know, I started giving nonviolence trainings when I was 19, and we would learn how to build blockades and work with the police and all that. But in addition to that, can we actually practice these kinds of things, these kinds of ways of opening up? A lot of, I might have said this before too, but in one of like the $1 million questions that I ask in the book Fierce Vulnerability is, what does it mean to organize protests that have the power to shut down highways or government buildings or whatever it might be, but move with the spirit of we're actually here to open things up? You know, activist movements oftentimes move this energy of we're here to shut things down, but I really believe, I've come to believe that injustice is a sign of collective trauma. Right? It's a manifestation of collective trauma, and you can't shut down trauma. Like, you can't shut down injustice any more than you can shut down trauma. So how do we move the spirit of opening things up, even amongst such polar opposite sides of a demonstration? So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, the more we practice, the easier those things become.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go in the opposite direction.
Cool.
Because that is the kind of height of tension at a protest between kind of countering positions. I want to go to the story. That exercise you had us do with appreciative inquiry was so powerful. And I'm going back to the image that you shared of the family sitting in awkward silence, right? So that process of moving from the awkwardness to appreciative inquiry. Can you talk about that? Because you don't just, you know, that image was so normal. I'm sure
Yeah.
many people saw it and was like, yep, I've seen that. I've been a part of that. You don't just show up one day to that dinner and like, hey, tell me your deep version. So can you talk a bit about moving from the awkwardness to a place of appreciative inquiry?
Yeah, so I'll share about my own family. As I shared, I come from a Japanese culture where we love negative peace. We just don't know how to get out of the awkwardness. And one of the ideas that I had recently that I'm gonna talk to my family about is, right now there's a lot of tension that I am having with my own mother. It's really difficult as she's aging. Some of her, she's, has more and more challenges. And I feel like a lot of the tension and the awkwardness comes from a lot of the frustrations that we have towards her that we don't know how to voice. And so I had this idea that rather than starting by building curiosity and asking her questions about the tension in our lives, that we should gather once a month or twice a month over Zoom and just ask her questions about her life. Like, she's aging, and particularly like my nephew who's 12 now, like, she probably doesn't know a lot of the stories of her life. Like, I don't know. My mother was disowned when I was 7 years old, so we lost our connection with a lot of our extended family. And even though some of those relationships got rebuilt 20 years later, we're still not as close as we used to be. And so, like, I would love to hear stories about my grandparents, because I stopped seeing them when I was 7 years old. And so, and I think as an aging person, she loves to tell stories, right? So just to like open up stories using some appreciative inquiry questions about the stories of her life as a way to practice just like sharing deeply with each other before we move to, okay, now can we talk about this thing that you do that is really frustrating me, right? So I think, it's harder to do at a protest, but with families and things like that, I think just by learning, like I remember, in my life, just because of the nature of my work, everywhere, like every Zoom call I'm on, we start with like a deep check-in. Like sometimes I find myself checking in like 6 times a day, and by the end of the day, like I'm completely checked out because I've checked in too much. But one time I was on a family Zoom call because we're also spread out. I was like, oh, let's do some check-ins, and I was shocked at my family's inability to do check-ins. Like they were constantly talking over each other. They actually didn't know how to check in and share what was going on in their lives. And I realized that something as normal as a check-in, which is so normalized in my life, like they just don't have those skills. So just slowing down and teaching each other how to do check-ins begins to unpack our inability to have deeper conversations, and then that then begins to build up the muscles for us to have harder and harder conversations. So again, like scaffolding, what are ways that we can get deeper and vulnerable with each other with like lower stakes and then eventually moving up? Sounds like you had a follow-up.
Because you said it, can you now give us a great example of how to do a check-in? Because I feel like that's a
yeah.
perfect
Yeah,
invitation.
totally.
And then I'll save the second part. Go for it.
Yeah, and then I want to actually share another tool too. So check-ins. One person talks at a time. My family is really bad at this. I don't know why. I think I've shared like the comfort stretch panic zone model, which is, many people are familiar with. It was created by an educator named Carl Ronk. He says that, we spend most of our days in the comfort zone, which is when we're comfortable, our emotions are regulated, we can breathe deeply, we have deep connections with people. But it's not where growth happens, it's not where learning happens, it's not where healing happens. All of that happens in the stretch zone, which is a place where by nature, by definition, we're uncomfortable, but we're still able to receive inputs, right? We're still able to stay connected to each other. And then if we stretch too much, we go into the panic zone where we're dysregulated and we lose our ability to have curiosity. And so a real check-in is inviting people into that stretch zone. Like, take off a couple of layers. Like, what's actually going on for you? What is challenging in your life? Or what is deeply joyful, right? And then couple more tools that I always use is, you talked about iMessages. iMessages are really deep, actually. I oftentimes struggle using iMessages. Sometimes we say things like, oh, you know how like when you're having a really difficult day and you get really stressed out, sometimes you want to just like eat and distract yourself. And you noticed I was just saying you, right? Or like, oh, sometimes when we're up against a really difficult time, or when we're at a protest and we're facing counter-protesters, we shut down and we're unable to, and I start using we messages. And there's something about that that like externalizes my own experience, because there's something vulnerable about saying, oh, when I'm at a protest and I'm facing counter demonstrators, I go into panic and I don't know how to get curious, right? So like really making sure that I'm using I language and not you and we languages, which is very common to do. No jiffing, which is a thing that I love. Jiffing is no judging, interpreting, fixing, or freezing. Like when I hear someone's story, I oftentimes judge them right away, or judge that person's story, saying, oh, well, this person is clearly a bad person. Or I interpret their story, oh, this thing is happening to them because they did this in their life. I'm trying to fix them, which I shared before, jumping right into strategies of how to fix that person's life. And then freezing that person in that moment. Like if someone shares a really vulnerable story, that's just one moment in their life. That's just one aspect of their life. 10 minutes from now, they might be a completely different person, so not freezing that person in that moment. So no jiffing. And then one final tool that I'll share is not trying to match tones. Like if you hear in a check-in circle, the person next to me shares something really deep and vulnerable that is filled with sadness and grief, first of all, that's a story that they're offering to the middle of the circle. I don't need to take that on. And if what I want to share is something joyful and light, that's my space to share that, right? And so these are some of the tools that I love to use in check-ins, and really continuing to practice that in the jam space when I go into you messages or we messages. My friend Shilpa oftentimes tries to correct me by saying this, like, come back to the I, come back to the I. And years ago when I started facilitating jams, this one time I was giving a little presentation and she kept doing this. And I thought she was like feeling what I was saying. It's like, I'm with you. So the whole time I kept going on and on. I was like, yeah, I must be on a roll, because Shilpa's like, and then I realized, oh, I'm using you and we messages all the time. So like it's a constant practice, right? And then the one last thing I'll share, which is a little unrelated, I don't think I've shared this here before at Rutgers, but there's a really beautiful Venn diagram of structure, skill, and relationship. And I really believe that to have difficult, vulnerable conversations with anybody in any context, you need at least two of those things present. So structure might be like a really structured agenda. It might be using a talking piece and making sure that only the person with the talking piece can share. All of these like structures that support vulnerable discussions. Relationship is like the depth of your relationship with the people that you're speaking to. And then skill is just like the skill of the people in the room to have those vulnerable conversations in a skillful way. If you don't have at least two of those things, like thinking about how you can raise the level of the relationship, skill, or structure. If you don't have structure, let's put together an agenda. If you don't have skill, bring in a facilitator. If you don't have relationships, do some relational activities before going into the activity. So how can you assess how much relationship, skill, and structure is there and raise the level of whatever is missing? And those things will really help too.
Fantastic. Okay, my last part, and
Cool.
what you just said gets to it. I asked the question in terms of family because that's the image. But the other thing I thought about, I had a great partner in our discussion, is what do you do, how do I ask this? Some spaces are uncomfortable and there's not relationship,
Yeah.
right? And so does that mean we just let the discomfort be, right? At what level or when do you use appreciative inquiry, or do you just let the how are you, I'm fine go? Like that.
Sorry, what was the last part?
The how are you, I'm fine. The like transactional passing. So just when it's not relationship, when it's not family, but you're in a workspace or you're in an environment where there's tension and that's normal, right? How do you show up? Where does appreciative inquiry fit? Or when do you say, okay, there's not structure, skill, or relationship, so tension is just going to have to exist? Like that's kind of the question. What do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, just by us engaging in our own practice of appreciative inquiry, we're increasing our own skill. So next time you're at that place, you might not have a relationship there, but at least there's still some skill there. And rather than just engaging in that conversation in a completely unstructured way, can you actually invite that person to have a structured dialogue with you about, like we're going to use this tool called appreciative inquiry. That's a structure. Or we're going to do check-ins with some of these ground rules. That's a structure. So there's ways that even if there's not relationship and skill and structure, that again, like you can raise some of those other tools, other ways that you can drop in a little bit more. Yeah. practice, right? Practice, practice, practice. Yeah. There's a Bruce Lee quote that says, I don't fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once. I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. You know, so like appreciative inquiry, check-ins, whatever it is. Like, and what was the Malcolm Gladwell book about like practicing something for 10,000 hours, you know? There's a question on the Zoom or?
Yes, we have a great question on the Zoom. What do you see happening in this moment that gives you hope for a better future?
I love that. So I don't know how many people are going to agree with this. It's a lot of what I talk about in my book, though. It is easy to lose hope right now if you believe that the systems that I believe are in a state of collapse right now are all we have. I believe we're in a time when our economic systems, our political systems, our democratic systems are in a state of collapse. And if we believe that those systems are the things that have always kept us safe, and that they're the only things that we have, then it's very easy to believe that, oh, if these systems collapse, then there's nothing that's going to keep me protected, nothing that's going to keep me safe. I don't believe that's the case. I actually believe that a lot of these systems and institutions have never been the thing that has kept us safe. And there are so many other systems that we are all part of that truly have been the thing that have resourced us, that have given us a sense of belonging, that have kept us safe. And these systems of small communities of people and relationships and small like economic systems, time banks and intentional communities and things like that, more and more of these systems are emerging all over the place. And you might not see it on the news. If you see the news, all you hear are stories of systems in collapse. But if you stay close to the ground, you hear so many stories about beautiful communities that are emerging out of nowhere to meet our most basic human needs of belonging and to be heard. And so I think it's really important to maintain a broader perspective and to know that, yes, there are a lot of systems that we have almost taken for granted that are in a state of crisis, but those are not the only systems that keep us safe. There are so many other communities that are thriving right now. And to remember that, like, if some of these current systems collapse, then others will emerge to take its place. And if we are resourcing those other alternative systems, then those systems are going to be what thrives on the other end of it. So, you know, a lot of my book is the subtitle is, what is it? Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. Like, a lot of things are in a state of collapse right now, but there are so many new systems that are emerging, and so to keep your eyes focused on those things too. Yeah. Jams, the thing that the gatherings that I just came back from, you know, like jams used to happen like 2 or 3 times a year or something, and now they happen like 50 times a year all over the world. There's jams that happen for every identity, every geography, and like these things are thriving. Braver Angels is thriving, you know. So, well, thank you so much again for having me. Yeah, always love coming back to Rutgers. Really appreciate the work that you all are doing, and yeah, look forward to joining you all again. So I'll pass the mic back to Joan. Thank you so much.
I am taking with me from that talk, Kazu, the need to hold space for curiosity, particularly when I'm challenged by ideas that are not my own or by the need to get curious. I often say, if I can cultivate generosity for curiosity, then I will be okay, even if it's like wild around me. I'm taking that with me, and a reminder to stay out of the binary, because then I lose depth, I lose richness, I lose often my ability to connect with people, and I don't want to do that. And so I'm also remembering then the power of a story and what that looks like, even for myself. What stories am I telling myself? And what stories do I hold for other people? For people joining us online, thank you so much. We are going to close ourselves out here. We are done in the main room for today's keynote. Kazu Haga, thank you so much.